So now I want to start talking about abortion, and this connects to the Singer piece in ways that don't seem obvious right away, but I'll come to it. So we're going to begin our discussion of abortion by discussing a woman named Judith Jarvis Thomson and her violinist example from her 1971 paper, A Defense of Abortion. And this relates to an exercise I had you do last week, and I asked you about these three cases, about Jim and Kim. They're homeowners, and they both build a pool, and then a child drowns in the pool. And the sort of Jim builds a fence around his pool, but Kim doesn't. And the sort of question that case ends with is Jim and Kim don't need pools. And furthermore, by building pools, they introduce risks to neighborhood children that did not exist before. Are Jim and Kim morally blameworthy for the children who drown in their pools by creating the drowning risk in the first place? Is it morally permissible to have a backyard pool? And then there's the next case, which is very similar, supposed to make the same point. Alan and Brian both drive to a pub to watch the game with friends. Alan drinks very little or none at all at the bar, knowing that he has to drive home later. In either case, Alan is in no way impaired once he leaves the bar several hours later. In contrast, Brian gets absolutely sloshed, and Brian stumbles out of the bar after fumbling with his keys for a bit and manages to get into his car and start his drive home. Let's say that on both of their drives home, there's a complicated intersection that tends to result in wrecks. Alan leaves the bar around 4, while driving home through this intersection, hits and kills a pedestrian. The wreck really isn't due to any driving mistake of Alan's. It was due to circumstances no driver could have averted. A few hours later, Brian is driving home and also hits and kills a pedestrian. Same sort of question. Alan and Brian don't need to watch the game collectively with friends. And furthermore, by driving to watch the game elsewhere, they introduce risks to pedestrians that would not exist if they had just stayed home. Are Alan and Brian morally blameworthy for the pedestrian who gets hit simply by putting them at risk by driving to an unnecessary event in the first place? Is it morally permissible to travel in a car when not absolutely necessary? And I take absolutely necessary to mean going to the grocery store to buy food, going to work to get the money to buy the food, but when you go hang out with friends, you're introducing risks to people that wouldn't exist if you didn't drive around in 3-ton death machines that have a tendency to crash into people and kill them. Is it morally permissible to drive places? And then lastly, Sue loves baseball, Ryan loves drag racing. Unfortunately, what Sue and Ryan have in common is that they participated in their beloved activity. While participating in their beloved activity, they unintentionally caused someone's death. Sue hits a fly ball that happens to leave the field of play and strike a pedestrian in the head, killing him instantly. While drag racing late at night through the city streets, Ryan strikes and kills a pedestrian that wasn't expecting a car to come twisting around an inner city street corner at 80 miles per hour. The question again, Sue and Ryan don't need to play sports like these, and furthermore, by playing baseball or drag racing, they introduce risks to others that would not otherwise have existed. Are Sue and Ryan morally blameworthy for the deaths that resulted from their actions? Is it morally permissible to play baseball or drag racing? The point of all these examples I take to be, I'm trying to make a point that Judith Jarvis Thomson makes in her paper, although she makes it with kind of these sci-fi crazy examples. So these are my more mundane, easier to relate to examples. But that basically anything you do living your life, like once you move beyond being a hermit who stays in your house and only leaves to get food and to do work in order to pay for that food, if you do like anything like play baseball, build a pool, go driving somewhere to see friends, you're introducing risks to other people that they wouldn't existed otherwise. And yet we don't think that those make you blameworthy or wrong for introducing those. You're not negligent. You're not responsible for these other people just because you put them at risk, because it seems like there's a certain minimum amount of risk that's connected to like not being a miserable hermit, to living a human life, that we think it's okay to introduce onto others. It's okay to partake in, and doesn't make you responsible for the lives of others, even though you're putting them at risks. And yet there's other cases where people are doing these extreme things that put people at very high risk for very unnecessary activities like drag racing, which we do think that introduces risks for unnecessary activities, and then we think that makes you negligent and responsible for when people die or are harmed or injured because of it. So the way Judith Jarvis Thomson doesn't give this thesis, but I think that this is something that is sort of lurking in the background of her paper, and I'll come back to it, which is what I call, the right to a life worth living thesis. People are within their rights to pursue interests vital to a life worth living, in such a way that their pursuits fall below a certain low threshold of risk for morally bad outcomes, such that they are thereby not responsible for any morally bad outcomes that might result from their pursuit of said interest. So, for example, baseball is not vital to a life worth living, but outdoor play activities like baseball, soccer, any of these sort of activities are introducing risks, very small risks, but introduce risks to other people. And it falls below a certain threshold. And if you cut out all of those activities of your life, you basically become a hermit and not be living a human life worth living. And so we don't think that you're not guilty of murder or homicide or manslaughter by playing baseball and accidentally, killing a passerby by the sort of freak outcome of that might result from playing baseball. Whereas we do think you're guilty of some sort of negligent manslaughter, homicide, if you are engaged in drag racing. The idea there is that there's a certain sort of outgoingness that is really crucial to a life worth living, driving to see friends, et cetera, that is necessary not to be a miserable hermit that's not living a human life, not a life worth living, that you should be able to engage in and not thereby be taking on the obligation that you're responsible for the risks that you're putting other people to or at. Such that you're not responsible for the risks that you're introducing to others because those just go along with being alive and living your life. Okay, so let's talk about Judith Jarver Thomson. She uses this famous example, she gives the example of this violinist. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a very famous unconscious violinist. She has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all of the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have thereby kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from her blood as well as your own. If she is unplugged from you now, she will die, but in some months she will have recovered from his ailment and can be safely unplugged from you. The question here is it morally permissible for you to unplug, or would you be murdering this person if you unplugged? Okay. Are you obligated to stay for several months? I want you to think about this in comparison to the singer example, right? Because in this case, the question is, again, is staying plugged into this violinist and keeping him alive, is that supererogatory? Is it charitable? Is it extra credit? Is it you doing something over and above? Wow, it's really great that you decide to stay for six months to keep this guy alive, but you're not committing murder. You're not violating your duties if you unplug, even though you know it's going to kill him. So it seems like Singer would say in this sort of case, yeah, you are obligated to stay plugged into this person because you're losing 6 months, which is not of comparable moral importance to this man's whole life. But Thomson thinks that this is a case of moral extra credit. It's only supererogatory that you stay. You're a saintly person. You're doing this really great thing if you stay, but you're not obligated to stay. You're not a bad person by not staying. It is charitable. It is extra credit for you to stay. That is Thomson's point about the violinist. So is it true that you may now morally permissibly unplug yourself from the violinist, even though this will cause her death? So we've got these categories: obligatory actions which an agent is morally praiseworthy for performing and blameworthy for not performing, actions that are good to do and bad not to do. Prohibited actions which an agent is morally praiseworthy for not performing and blameworthy for performing, so actions that are bad to do and good not to do. Permissible actions which an agent is not morally praiseworthy for performing or blameworthy for not performing, so actions that are neither good nor bad. And then we've got the supererogatory actions which an agent is morally praiseworthy for performing, but not blameworthy for not performing. So they're good to do, but not bad not to do. And so Thomson wants to say staying plugged into the violinist, keeping him alive, is supererogatory. So Thomson's violinist analogy, that its most obvious application is to the case of rape, so pregnancy in the case of rape, she wants to say that the fetus needs the woman's body for 9 months to live, and pregnancy is not a simple process. It involves a lot of physical changes. It involves risk, even when a normal pregnancy comes with a risk of death, right? Like even if you just there is a base level of death from pregnancy, even without any sort of known complications so you're already, if you just go through the pregnancy, you're already incurring a risk. You're going to incur all sorts of changes to your body, permanent changes to your body. It might involve you taking time off from work, strains on your relationship, missing opportunities at your job and your career. It's also just like a very long and difficult process. So the claim here Thomson wants to say is abortion is perfectly permissible in this case, in the cases of rape, because it's like being the violinist who needs to be plugged into you to stay alive. You don't owe it to the violinist to keep him alive. He has no right to your body. He has no claim to using your body just because he needs it. You can unplug from him. He's a full adult with all the rights of a person, and when you unplug, you know he's going to die. So even if the fetus is a full adult, or a potential person who has the same, even if the fetus has a right to life, you can unplug. It's only supererogatory that you let the fetus use your body to stay alive in the cases of rape, just like it's only supererogatory that you stay plugged in to the violinist. That's the cases of rape. J.J. Thomson, I think, wants to extend this to even further cases, to cases of failed contraception. So assuming we think about condoms, or even more effective, the sort of implanted copper rings, or a very effective birth control. I don't know if she has in mind 80%, 90%, 99% contraceptives, but I mean, they fail because of factory defects in the condom. They fail because of maybe weird biology. Facts about your body just makes the copper ring not work in the right sort of way. It might fail for any sort of lightning strike, rare, weird reasons, and so the failure rate on a lot of these forms of contraception, not so much the rhythm method, but I think for condoms and probably the best is the copper rings that you can get implanted, which last for 5 to 10 years, or until you take them out. That is a case where if it fails, she wants to say, similar to rape, it's not your fault. Why is it not your fault? This goes back to a right to life worth living thesis, I think, right? That sex and sexuality and having sex with partners and exploring other people's bodies and your own sexuality, and that is a part of human life. It's a part of not being a hermit. It's a part of engaging in all the aspects of life, particularly in loving relationships, but I think maybe beyond that too. And we shouldn't expect people to completely cut that out of their lives, given the low risk that they're introducing if they're using an effective contraception, such that they're not responsible for the pregnancy if there's a factory defect in the condom. Just like Sue is not really responsible for the baseball fly ball hitting the pedestrian, I'm sure pedestrians die from fly balls in baseball at least once every 20 years, at least, probably a little more than that. And yet we don't think that people are committing negligent homicide when they play baseball and that happens. We think that is just a part of the risk that you're allowed to introduce to other people and you're not responsible for. And similarly, that sex with contraceptives does involve introducing the risk of the condom failing because of a factory defect, and then there being a fetus that now depends on your body for life, but that you're not responsible for keeping that fetus alive, and it doesn't have a right to your body because that risk was, in line with this right to a life worth living thesis, that it's just a part of human life to engage in sexuality, and that you built a fence around your pool, that you played a low-risk game like baseball, right? You had sex with contraceptives to try preventing, to a very high degree of success, pregnancy, and there was this sort of lightning strike world weird circumstance that led to a failure, and that she does not think that in that case it actually makes the fetus's life something that you have a responsibility for. So just like in the case of rape, it's supererogatory for you to see a pregnancy through when you have a case of failed contraception, but it's not obligatory. So then it's permissible to have an abortion, although it is nice of you if you don't, both in the case of rape and in the case of failed contraception. She does seem to think that if you didn't use contraception and were reckless, just like drag racing, then you are responsible and you can't, it's not supererogatory. It's actually obligatory because you have incurred that risk by being reckless in that way. So it's not just extra credit for you to avoid having an abortion. It's actually required for you not to have an abortion. Similarly, if you plan to have a child with your husband, you're 6 months in, you find out that your husband or that has been sleeping with his side piece, and then you have a divorce, and now you don't want the kid. Well, tough luck. That wasn't that you intentionally got pregnant. You incurred the risk. I mean, like, this was an intentional pregnancy, and you're on the hook for it. You can't treat it. Wasn't an accident in the way that failed contraception is. You might say, well, isn't having sex at all taking on this risk? Again, I mean, it's similar to playing baseball. You're taking on some risk, but it's not a risk that we think. It's such a minimal risk, and it's such a crucial part of human life that we think that this is Thomson's argument, that it doesn't put you on the hook when bad outcomes happen. And so the claim is you're not responsible. But also the analogy with rape, I mean, she also talks about how, listen, unless you have a hysterectomy, like, you are, we don't want to say rape victims just by going out of their house to a club and getting drunk are now, well, you opened yourself up to that possibility by engaging in any sort of, just like leaving your house or not having a hysterectomy, which completely removes the ability of getting pregnant. We might say, even like, we think we are already willing to say, rape victims, other than getting a hysterectomy, like, they continue to make choices which put them at risk of being raped and then getting pregnant. And then if we're saying people are responsible for any risk of being pregnant that their choices introduce, choosing not to get a hysterectomy, choosing to be alone with men, not living in the sort of really restrictive cultures that certain countries require women to be in groups, I guess, then you're introducing this risk of getting pregnant through rape. And we don't think that, I think correctly, we don't think that that is something the woman is responsible for, and it is supererogatory if she wants to keep the child or keep the fetus. So we don't hold people responsible for introducing. So we're already on this spectrum of saying there's a certain amount of risk that's not on you to eliminate. All the sort of risk basically with rape, I think the claim is, like, it's not on the part of the woman to have a hysterectomy to avoid the possibility of getting pregnant. So she's introducing the risk of getting pregnant, but that risk is not something she's responsible for if it happens where she's raped and then made pregnant. Similarly, there is this very low risk of having sex with effective contraception. And so it's on that same spectrum. The question is, there's not this on and off difference between rape and failed contraception. It's a spectrum, and it's where we want to draw that, where we think that drawing that line is the correct place. And Thomson is thinking that abortion in the case of rape is permissible, and not having an abortion is supererogatory but not obligatory. Similarly with failed contraception, although she argues that maybe abortion in general is not permissible if you're not practicing some sort of effective birth control that's eliminating risks, like the person who builds the fence around their pool. So this Jewish Jobs Thomson article, it connects up to both the Singer piece, because it's talking about what's supererogatory and what's obligatory. It also connects up to the cases that I asked you about last week and the right to a life worth living thesis. And then next week, we're going to do more on abortion. Thomson's article here assumes that the fetus is a person and has rights. And the question is, well, even if they have rights, just like the violinist who's a full adult who has rights, it might be okay to unplug and do things that will kill them because you're not responsible for them. Next week, we're going to look at some people who say you know what, the fetus isn't even a person. So like you can have an abortion just like cutting down a tree. You don't want the kid, it's fine. And then another person who's going to argue not that it's a person, but actually that it's going to be a person, or it's an individual who will gain personhood later, and that's enough to give the individual the full rights to life that a person has. And the Thomson article is assuming that the person who gives the fetus the right to life is successful. And then she's arguing, even if it's successful, abortion is still permissible in the cases of rape and failed contraception. And it's only supererogatory for you not to have one.